Everyone enjoys a good story. For many, it's a means of escape. It's entertaining. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's soothing. We exchange stories all the time, and oftentimes in the past, stories have been a means of exchanging information. It's like mixing vegetables with something that's a little bit tastier for children. It makes it easier to go down. Hence the story. Stories go over really well with children, especially at bedtime. You're trying to coax one to sleep, settle down an excited mind after a long, hopefully fun day. You tell them a bedtime story. And Bible bedtime stories have been pretty popular. However, there's some stories, some Bible stories, that parents and others have skipped over because those stories are not deemed appropriate to tell children. They're not as comforting. They're not as soothing. In fact, some of those stories can be unsettling. Some of these stories may be scary. And yet, they still need to be told. As we're approaching the Feast of Tabernacles, not just the Feast of Tabernacles, as we're approaching the Feast of Trumpets, a day which pictures Christ returning to the earth and removing the present government and reestablishing the government of God. There are things that we can catch up on and learn. There are stories to be told. And some of these stories, for some of us, have not been heard before. Some of this information may be new, as some of us are new. Others are receiving these stories once more, and it's a refresher course, as it is every year. So, in preparation for approaching the Feast of Trumpets, I'll tell a story. So let's turn to Amos 3, verse 7. And in turning to Amos, the point is to clarify the means of the story. This particular story is not meant solely for entertainment. It's not meant as an escape. Amos 3 and verse 7. Here God points out, surely the Lord God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets.
That is true.
There are things, there are information that God exchanges to us that is meant to keep us updated, to keep us posted on things that are coming. In exchange, we are to prime ourselves in getting ready. And the purpose of such a story is not to entertain you, and it's not to make the time go by. It is to be utilized so that something constructive can be done. Further aspect of a story can be seen in Daniel 12, chapter 12, verse 10. And here in chapter 12, verse 10, God points out concerning a lot of the information that he's passed on. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. And here's the catcher. But the wise shall understand. There's a degree of fluency. There's a degree of proficiency that is needed in applying this understanding. This application of understanding, this need for understanding, once more is pointed out, or I could show again, in Isaiah chapter 28. Isaiah chapter 28, and in verse 9. Whom will he teach knowledge, it is asked? And whom will he make to understand the message? Whom will he make to understand this instruction? Whom will he make to understand this story? What is necessary is that we take this understanding, we take these messages, these stories that we hear, and that we apply it and glean things from it, and inducing it into application. It is necessary for us to take things that we've learned and build upon that with new things that we learn. In much the same way that children are taught in school, they're learning, say, math equations. They understand and learn that 2 plus 2 is 4. They need to understand that 2 plus 2 is 4 before they find out what additionally can be done to get 6. And they will build on that. If you take that child's understanding that 2 plus 2 is 4 and explain to them that they can open a bank account with 2% interest, but if they don't keep a $3,000 minimum, they will be charged a $100 surcharge, you just lost them. Because they're not that far yet. But they will be. And in time, they will get from 2 plus 2 and reach a point where they're able to discern, I think I could get a better deal at another bank. That takes time. But that's the process. And that's what we must do with ourselves. And that's what we are reading here as we go to the next verse. The question was posed, who will understand this message? Who will understand the story? And rhetorically it is asked, those just weaned from milk? Those just drawn from the breast? As with children, begin on a liquid diet. They aren't skilled enough in terms of how they digest food to approach steak. Not yet. And so the same way that we deal with knowledge and that we deal with understanding about God, there are steps that we take. And as we increase in our knowledge, we apply that to what we've already learned. Continuing on in verse 10, for precept must be upon precept, or commandment upon commandment. Commandment upon a commandment, meaning the understanding that we've learned. These basics and these rules are now applied to the other foundational understandings that we already have. Continuing on, line upon line, or degrees of measurement, or rulers of measurement, in terms of once you've learned one thing, you are now applying new knowledge, new understanding, new aspects to what you've already learned. Where do you position that in respect to what you've learned? Where's that measuring point that you add that to? That's what's happening here. That's what's being encouraged. That's what we must do when we hear God's word and when we hear these stories. And finally, the last line of verse 10, here a little, there a little. Now, oftentimes, this verse is used to point out that we take different portions of information from different parts of the Bible, different parts of Scripture, and we put them together to get an understanding. That is not what is being said here, but that is true. That is true. And not only is it true, it applies to what I am saying today. In terms of understanding these things as we approach God, in terms of processing the stories that we do hear. So, in preserving this understanding and applying it, it's necessary to do certain things. There are certain fundamentals that have to be in place continuously. Be it prayer, be it study, be it the endurance, and then repeat. This is what is constantly necessary to keep ourselves spiritually fit. To not do so, it will bring us to a point where seemingly we may be okay, but inwardly we may not be. And that's the thing. Most are unable to tell your condition inwardly. They can guess at it. They can surmise at it. It ain't true. You will know them by their fruits. But oftentimes, by the time you recognize the fruits, things have been a little bit more progressed. But beyond that point, you can't just look at someone immediately and tell what stage they're at, what their relationship is like with God, what kind of spiritual condition they're in. It's hard. Because it's hard enough with our own selves. That being said, there are people of our flock that may very well keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimonies of Christ, and yet still not be in the optimum condition. Many of us, I'm sure, may have grown up in a home where there was a piece of furniture that was there but wasn't to be used. If guests came by and they tried to sit in that chair, whoa, 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 whoa. No, don't sit there. The chair's not good. If not at home, in the past, then perhaps in your home now. And if not in your home now, definitely you've encountered this at work. Don't use that chair. The chair, for all extensive purposes, looks like any other chair. It appears to be able to serve the way a chair should serve. But when someone goes to sit in that chair, they're warned, wait a minute, don't do that. Because the chair can't function the way you would expect a chair to function. Looks like it can, but when put to the test, when pressure is applied, it will give. We may liken that to our conditions if we do not pray, study, endure, and repeat. So much like that chair with the loose leg, looks like it's fine. And so we might too. And internally, this is what we need to be doing at home, in the privacy of our lives and our minds and our relationships with God, so that we can process these stories the way that we need to. And so, let's begin our story. And I'll start with the story in the introduction, or with the introduction, in Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is known as the Olivet Prophecy. It is one of 3 accounts. Another account is given in Mark chapter 13. And another one is given in Luke 21. They describe events that will precede and that might initiate the return of Christ, the series of events that might initiate the return of Christ, and the things that will lead up to Christ's return to this earth and removing the present system that's in force right now. Not only do these 3 accounts mirror each other, they're pretty much saying the same thing. They are also expounded upon in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And so, we'll start with Matthew chapter 24 and verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Christ had been speaking in the temple and teaching, and now he's leaving and he's going his own way. The disciples approach him, and they approach him and they make comments about the buildings, about the temple building, in much the same way that we would make comments if we go to New York City. And we see the grandeur of the city and the buildings and the lights that are there. Perhaps, even though we are native to New York or have been living here and this is our residency, it's still kind of gives you a moment of awe when you go, particularly to tourists when they come. This is the same effect that the disciples are having. And they said to Jesus, "Do you not see all of these things?" "Assuredly," Christ answered, "I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Christ responded to their amazement by telling them a time was coming where this structure, this building that seemed immovable, a part of their society and culture that seemed like it will be there forever, and it was so substantial that the time will come where one stone won't be left upon another. Many of the things that Christ would have to say, and things that are in the Bible, have a duality to them, where there may have been some aspect that took place in the past that will still continue to happen in the future, will be finalized in the future. This happens to be one of those things, because even to this day, there are still stones that are left upon another. They haven't all fallen off. There's still things that need to occur. Needless to say, continuing on in verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, or when you will establish the kingdom, and of the end of the age?" And remember, the disciples at that time thought that everything was going to occur in their day. They didn't have the sense that things would happen in the future. And can you imagine how disheartening that may have been, to be told that the things were going to take another 2,000 years or so more afterwards? In the version of Mark 13, verse 3, when their disciples approached him, they approached him privately, and it was only 4 of them. Now, in reading from Mark chapter 13, verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" They were asking, what's going to bring everything on and make everything unravel? Isn't this what we ask ourselves, if not on a daily basis? To ourselves when we're thinking, when we hear the news, how can we not? When are things going to change? When will things finally break? What's the last straw? So Christ begins to answer them. And mind you, he is not speaking to the public. He's speaking to the church. At this point, it's just for disciples. But this isn't something that he's exclaiming to the masses at large. He's not in the temple. He's not talking to a crowd. He's just talking to 4 of his disciples privately. This information, this story, has been passed on, but it's for the church, not the world at large. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." People are going to come in the future that are going to talk about Christ, talk about what he did, who he was, and yet omit degrees of truth. They will not relay the information that we have gleaned today. And in fact, the God of the Bible doesn't seem to match the God of popular Christianity. It is said that Satan has deceived the whole world. And thus, this message of this Christ, of God that people speak, that has gone around the world, that has been so universal, that has been so Catholic, is reflective of popular Christianity today, and some of the means of laying some of that groundwork that has been done by the Catholic Church and all of its other offshoots. Even still, what Christ is beginning to describe is paralleled in Revelation 6. In Revelation 6, you have descriptions of horses that reflect a degree or aspects of life that impact the world and society in a negative way. So initially, Christ touches on this religious deception, and it corresponds to the meaning of the horse that is shown in Revelation 6. And here we cut into the story where John is the note-taker of this vision, and he reveals what he sees. "And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." Reflective of what religion has done over the years, and in its deception, and its aggressiveness in getting the world to follow its confinement of what God is, who God is, and how God should be worshipped. Continuing on with the next example of a horse that reflects negative aspects that impact life, John recounts another horse that he sees. Fiery red went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. These horses are being drawn to and depicted as being controlled by Satan. And it is Satan that is contributing and moving these aspects to affect society the way it does. When we return to the description that Christ is given, that we're applying to how these horses are to be seen, when we go to the next description that Christ gives in verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. What he's saying is that there are aspects that are negative, but that's not the problem. That's not the issue. That's not the straw that's going to break the camel's back. That's not the one that's going to set everything into a tailspin. It won't be religious deception. He then moves on to war, and he cites, but the end is not yet. Or in other words, no, that's not it. Continuing in Revelation, we see another horse. And this horse was black, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine, referring to food. And as you go through Christ's account, and he continues to describe things, the next thing that he touches on are famines in the middle of verse 7. And that would account for the description of that horse that we read. And then the final horse is death. And as you continue on in Revelation 6, it is a horse that is pale, and Hades is with it, meaning the grave. And it receives all those that will die from the other harsh conditions that we find in life, as Christ goes on, referring to pestilences and earthquakes. And again, Christ says, all these things are the beginning of sorrows. In other words, that's not it. That's not what is the sign that things are finally coming apart. Because this has always been the case. There's always been these aspects of life that has affected humanity. Christ continues on in verse 9 of chapter 24. Then they will deliver you. They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended. People will be turned off by the true way of life, turned off by relating to each other, turned off from God. And this is happening because of the world that surrounds them. There's a degree of lawlessness that has increased to such a propensity that it is affecting those that do keep God's way of life. And it's affecting how they see things. It's affecting how they process the world. It's affecting how they apply prayer and study and endurance and their repetition of those aspects. And in turn, it affects their behavior, it affects their actions, and they become that chair with the loose leg. Christ continues on. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. There will become aspects of theology and points about how to live, how God sees things that begin to affect people in the church. Again, remember, he's not talking to the world at large. He's talking to people and directing his comments to people in the church. There are going to be aspects about how we see things that are going to go astray, that people and leaders, people of significance that have a voice, that are being heard, are going to begin to say things that may not be appropriate. And Christ continues in verse 12, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. And it's these conditions that the church finds itself in. It's this culture, this atmosphere that makes it so that those that are following God will have a hard time in going against that resistance of the lawlessness of life. But all the while this is going on, there are other things happening that people may not be aware of. There are things happening in the spiritual realm. There are other things taking place that we may not see. And this is brought out in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Paul is addressing the theologians and informing them of what must happen before the resurrection, how these things will occur. And he explains, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of the resurrection, the day when Christ returns to establish his kingdom, that moment, that period in time, continuing on, will not come until the rebellion occurs. This word for rebellion, depending on how the translators translate, depending on which version of the word they see fit, or they see themselves as translating, they will either get this word rebellion, or they will get a falling away, as some of the other translations have. Rebellion is more accurate. There is going to be some type of rebellion, and following this rebellion, there's a man that is supposed to be introduced onto the scene, according to what Paul is saying. Continuing on, For that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed. And this man, this person, is deemed to be a man doomed to destruction or son of perdition, or just someone that's going to die prematurely. Another person that had this designation was Judas. Or more specifically, someone that would have fulfilled Judas's role. It turned out to be Judas. But someone that would have been designated to be the son of perdition, someone that was designated to die prematurely. Prophecy established that someone filling that role had to undergo this manner of things transpiring. And so the same holds for this individual that's spoken of here. Continuing about this person, he will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, or he has this sense of, by means of authority, who he is exacting to be, and in so proclaiming himself to be God. So we have what's being established that first a rebellion must occur, and after this rebellion, there's an individual that's going to be introduced onto the scene that has some significance in how things are going to play out as we continue on. And we can continue to see how this story unfolds as we turn over to Revelation 12. And in Revelation 12, in verse 7, we have described a war where Satan once upon a time tried to overthrow God. His time is running out and he realizes he doesn't have much time left. And he attempts another coup. In verse 7, and war broke out in heaven, of Revelation 12. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. Essentially, Satan is kicked out. His ID is taken. His fob key is removed. He no longer has access to heaven. He's unable to return for counsel and audiences with God, like we read in Job. He's been permanently fired and escorted out by security. Continuing on in verse 9, so the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And dropping down to verse 12, here it is recounted, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Meaning, good riddance, the sentiment is. This guy is gone. He was so much trouble. And then the sentiment that is continued is like, oh man, but he came down to earth. And that's messed up for you guys. And as we continue, for the devil has come down to you having a great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and to the sea, this angel recounts, because problems will ensue afterwards. So as it was pointed, a rebellion must occur. But after that rebellion, this man that was described comes onto the scene. And there are actually other individuals that appear onto the scene at this time. If we turn to Revelation 13 and verse 11, here we have a description of what takes place. Satan is now cast back down to the earth. He realizes he has a short amount of time left. It is his intent to deceive the world even more so. It is his intent to hurt those that are the children of God. And it is his intent to bring destruction to the earth if he's allowed to do so. And in enacting this plan, he first begins to introduce an individual that is a religious leader. And this person is imbued with the ability to do miracles and all sorts of other wonders. And it will be very effective. Continuing in chapter 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. The previous beast that was spoken of was a beast that described a political structure, a political entity, a political person that will come onto the scene and present themselves as Christ and say that they are God having returned. And this beast that is being described here in this passage is a beast that has two horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. It is motivated by Satan. Continuing in verse 12, and he referring to this individual here in this passage, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast, this previous beast, this political entity, this person that professes themselves to be Christ. He does miracles in front of this person that professes themselves to be Christ. This person that turns out to be the Antichrist. The individual that we read of will do miracles in their presence and cause the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, that political structure, this Antichrist individual, whose deadly wound was healed, meaning this governmental structure has had many revivals in this area of Europe, be it the Babylonians, be it the Persians, be it the Greeks, be it the Romans, be it the other incarnations of political structures in that time, governments that were around during World War I, or Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. These entities have revived itself and have been healed after going into submission and then coming back onto the world scene. Continuing about this individual that works in tandem with the Antichrist. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast or this Antichrist personage, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast. The image of the beast, political pundits or the creation of one's image and what's the word I'm looking for? Public perception. Image is everything. And this is what's being crafted here. That image, that personage of who he is and is professing to be. And continue on that the image of the beast, or this Antichrist, should both speak and cause as many that would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. This political structure comes onto the scene and has strong power and strong influence. And this is initiated by this individual that serves as a religious authority that is granted the power to do miracles, also known as the false prophet. This false prophet will point to this other individual that will come out of obscurity and say, this person is Christ, this person is God, this person has been in hiding all this time and has now decided it is the appropriate time for him to reveal himself. A little more about this person is seen in Daniel 8, chapter 23. In Daniel 8, chapter 23, it's said of this individual that will present themselves as Christ. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. This man, this political ruler, will be charismatic, and he will have great skills in diplomacy. And enacting his diplomacy, many countries will initially believe that he is God, that he is Christ, and they will willingly give power and control over to him. And he will do this seamlessly without problems and without difficulty. Many have questioned how this will come about. Once upon a time, it was believed that these 10 horns or 10 kings that would be working in tandem with the Antichrist would be represented by 10 nations in Europe, or 10 nations that would form the European common market. Other perceptions of how this might play out, some believe that it could be 10 nations scattered about the world, and it may not be simply isolated to Europe. In some of these possibilities, it may involve, say, even the United States and other Western nations, because these nations are Christian nations and they follow popular Christianity. They would be primed to be ever more responsive to such a person. And in the past, that has always seemed a bit of an enigma, because the Western nations have been seen as the lost tribes of Israel. And it was always believed that those peoples would also fall under subjection to what the beast power was doing. for those that prescribe to that possible scenario. And who knows if that will play out. There are certain things that they point to that would show that if such a scenario were to play out, that initially these Western nations are supportive of the beast's power for about 1.5 years. And then after 1.5 years, it becomes clear that maybe this man is not who he says he is. That maybe this man isn't as wholehearted as they once thought. And they attempt to now stop him militarily. They attempt to overcome him, and they are unable to. It's too late. And they too are fall into subjection with that scenario, with some of the points of reference that people might use. But who's to say how things will play out? But needless to say, this man is not acting alone. He has 10 other nations or countries that are supporting him. Even the Islamic and Asian countries are in support of him initially. Continuing on, he will become very strong, but not by his own power, as I mentioned. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take a stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, not by human power. As was mentioned before, the way his scenario plays out, he is killed by Christ, the real one, in person. So, in the story that's being told, we have these demographics where you have wars, you have famines, you have pestilences, you have lots of death occurring throughout man's history, and yet, that's not it. Continuing on towards the end time, you have the church, and it is affected by the lawlessness that's surrounding it. And in turn, their spirituality begins to decline and become affected, and become more so like that chair with a broken leg. In so doing, at this time, there's been a revolt, a rebellion. And when Satan is cast down, he in turn begins to initiate a man of religious stature or religious authority, perhaps the Pope, to begin to do miracles and point out that this other individual here that has come out of obscurity is Christ, is the Antichrist, and the world will believe it and follow him. At that same time, there are other individuals that will come on the scene. And we have 2 individuals that are called the 2 witnesses. And we can read about them in Revelation 11. Revelation 11 and verse 3. And here we have God recounting, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. Here we have numbers that will be repeated. I work with men and women that have been incarcerated, and oftentimes their sense of time, the way they count it, is different. The person that comes from a non-incarcerated background, we see time in years. And we may go, 2 years have gone by, or I did this 2 years ago. Whereas these individuals that have previously been incarcerated, the way they count time, they'll say, oh yeah, I did that 24 months ago. And when I'm talking to them, I'm like, what? And then they catch themselves and they go, oh yes. And then they recalibrate and structure their time differently. Because in their world, that's how they see time, months. So 24 months is what I would call 2 years. I would never compartmentalize time into months. That's just how I do. But it's not akin to what they're doing. Likewise, this number, 1,260 days, is reflective of 3.5 years. You will see this time period represented and put out in other scenarios as well. So that 1,260 days could be 42 months. That 1,660 days could be that, 42 months, or connotated as a time, times, and half a time, still meaning 3.5 years. This designation, among other points of reference, things that happen around the same period of time, is given degrees of notation, because it's at these occurrences where you will have that point, and thereafter, 3.5 years will pass by before Christ's return from those points of reference. So right here, from this point of reference, once you have this false prophet come on the scene, doing miracles, and introducing and being the hype man for another individual who he says is Christ, and then you have these two witnesses come on the scene, there will be 3.5 years from that point until Christ would return, roughly. And that's what this is saying. Continuing on about these two witnesses in verse 4 of Revelation chapter 11. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. There have been references to lampstands as you're reading Revelation, but there have also been references to lampstands and olive trees in the book of Zechariah in chapter 4, without an explanation as to who they are. And so now we have, years later, an explanation finally given as to what that meant. And continuing on. And if anyone wants to harm them, referring to these 2 witnesses, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues, and as often as they desire. So in this scenario, we have the false prophet, we have the Antichrist, and now we have 2 men that are countering what those other 2 individuals are saying. But these men are of God. Incidentally, in the days of Elijah, he made it stop raining on Israel. But that went on for 3.5 years. Incidentally, Moses was seen by the Egyptians as the face of all of those plagues. And so we have men that seem to have similar roles. In the past, it was thought that these 2 men would come out of obscurity also. There's also been another kind of suggestion as people try to wonder who could these men be. And there's been certain schools of thought that would try to say these 2 men could possibly be Elijah and Moses resurrected. At first, it sounds a little far-fetched. But sometimes when you hear these proposals and see some of the things that they might use to support them, it may sound like something that might be entertained. And mind you, everything happening around this time period is so crazy. How can you say what's normal and what isn't normal at this point? Nevertheless, continuing on, we turn to Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, in verse 13, we return back to the Olivet prophecy. And here Christ continues, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. That person that applies those fundamentals and that avoids turning into that chair with a broken leg and can be more than just someone that looks like a Christian, but actually internally is. Continuing on, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached, and all the world is a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Another description of what those 2 witnesses will be doing. Now, many look at this and see this as a commission by the church to go out and spread the gospel to the world. And although that this is something that happens organically, naturally, when you have an entity of a group of people that are keeping God's way of life, without a doubt, that influence will travel outside of them and affect others, influence others, and bring them into the understanding of God. This is specifically talking about a reach even greater than that. To reach around the world with that kind of degree is something that will be happening with the 2 witnesses to counter things that are happening with the false prophet and the Antichrist. Continuing on to verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, and then in parentheses, whoever reads, let him understand, as if saying, wink, wink. This reference to the abomination of desolation, as I've mentioned before, a lot of things have occurred in the past, and there was a duality to it. In the past, there was a point in time when an outside military force came into the temple, set up an idol there, and the nobles of the Jewish clans of that time, the Maccabees, were able to force them out militarily. And so people now think that when these things begin to happen again, that it will be a reiteration of some form of desecration by means of a statue. There are different aspects and views to that. I'm simply going to use the aspect as I move forward that Luke gives in Luke 21. And in Luke 21, in Luke 21 and verse 20, and in the version of Luke, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Here, the desolation is associated with an army surrounding Jerusalem. And so, what we find happening is the beast power, or rather this false witness, the false prophet, and the Antichrist, understand that he has to be perceived as Christ. And so he will do things to make it seem as if he is. He's going to approach Jerusalem and make that his capital of rulership. It is also said that he's a great diplomat. And oftentimes in modern day contemporary news, Israel can come off as kind of stubborn and very just unrelenting in how they want to do things. This man may be such a diplomat and may be seen as carrying out a diplomatic initiative and even doing this, but yet armies are sent to Jerusalem and they surround Jerusalem. And we could see this playing out in even greater significance in Daniel. People see this to have a significance. These occurrences, just the mere false prophet coming on the scene, just the mere man coming on the scene claiming to be Christ, just the mere two witnesses coming on the scene is quite enough. But there are other occurrences that happen that people connotate as being very substantial. And one of them is seen in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away. And here we have reference to a sacrifice. It is believed that as things progress, Israel, modern day Israel, at some point is going to bring back animal sacrifices. People begin to wonder what in the world is going to move Israel to do such a thing, spook them to such a degree that they're going to bring back animal sacrifices. Could it be that they find the Ark of the Covenant? Could it be that when the false prophet comes on the scene, they're going to think that's Elijah, that the Messiah is coming? Could it be that the Antichrist makes them very uneasy? Or could it be that all other nations kind of back away from them, and now they're on their own and they're doing everything unilaterally? Needless to say, they turn to, when there's no one else to turn to, they turn to God. And they institute sacrifices once more. People see that as being very significant. Continuing on, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, using the definition that is in Luke, that abomination of desolation would be the armies that surround Jerusalem. Once those armies come and surround Jerusalem, it circumvents the sacrifices, and the sacrifices are stopped. And this verse is saying, when those sacrifices are stopped, when that army surrounds Jerusalem, there shall be 1,290 days. We already touched on the time period when we touched on 1,260. That's 3.5 years. This is also 3.5 years plus 30 days. There's a 30-day difference. That 30-day difference is accounted for because when that army surrounds Jerusalem, initially they don't attack. They surround it and besiege it for 30 days. Perhaps that is a diplomatic gesture. Who knows why that is done? But they surround that city and don't attack it for 30 days. Needless to say, the Bible is saying from that point, and counting on, that's when Christ returns. From the point that army attacks the city, 3.5 years will go by before Christ returns. This verse is saying, from the point those sacrifices are stopped, from the point that army surrounds the city but doesn't attack, will be 1,290 days, a 30-day difference from what we previously read. Continuing to the next verse. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Now we have more numbers. This number is also different. So we have one number, 1,260 days, 3.5 years, from when the two witnesses come on the scene till Christ returns. From how long the beast power will be in power in Jerusalem, 3.5 years. From how long it'll be from when they surround Jerusalem, plus 30 days until that city is attacked, until Christ returns. Now we have another number presented. And this number is suggested to be when the sacrifices begin. And this is 45 days before the 1,290. So you have the army attacks Jerusalem, or rather surrounds the city, but doesn't attack. And there's 30 days prior before they do that. Then there's 45 days before that. It's suggested that that's when the sacrifices begin. That is significant because there is a school of thought that believes when those sacrifices begin, that is the time for those in the body of Christ to run and run to Jerusalem, run to Judea. There are two mindsets to that. There's one that says they ought to run when that happens. And there's another mindset that counters that says, well, that would be ridiculous to do that. That mindset that says they ought to run to Jerusalem often uses Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 1 through 2, where it says, gather together, before the decree is issued. The mentality is, according to that proposal, and I merely explain this because it is good to understand how others are thinking in the body of Christ. That there's this perception of how things might unfold. And the thought is that people will, wherever they are in the world, will gather together and then run to Jerusalem and then gather together again and then from there run into the place of protection. There's another school of thought that says that's crazy, why would you do that? The Bible says don't enter the city again. So there are other schools of thought that feel that is not appropriate to do. Needless to say, for those that do think that that happens, and the mentality is they have to do that before the decree is given, as it says in Zephaniah. That decree would be the one that says, if you do not have the stamp on your hand and on your mind, you cannot buy, you cannot sell, you can't function. If you don't have a birth certificate, if you don't have your social security card, if you don't have your ID, if you don't have your green papers, if you don't have your working papers, you can't function. According to the mentality of people that believe that to run, once those sacrifices are begun, and there's that 45 days where they have a window before those armies come and surround Jerusalem, they believe they're supposed to run because once that decree is given, you can't buy a ticket to leave. You won't be able to do anything. You won't have money. You won't be able to function. They believe you have to get there quickly and then situate yourself so that you can be moved to the place of safety. Who knows if that's how things will play out? But one thing is for sure, whatever you do, you are to follow the way we are supposed to be living now and live right now and trust that if you do that, God will protect you. In the past, during those times when the Roman army came to attack Israel, it is said that people heard voices that told them to run, that people had dreams and they were removed to petrol. Who's to say how things will play out today in this day and age in a more global society? And as these things play out, this is the mentality that we are to have, staying true to living right, so that no matter what happens and how things play out, we still do the right thing, and we'll be protected by God. This story, as it continues on, has perhaps the church in a designated area, but then you have another aspect of the church, a remnant of the church, that Satan would go after, that's left behind, that didn't leave, that didn't run. He tries to go after the church, and she's given wings and flies into the wilderness. Water comes out of the dragon's mouth. Perhaps the army's chasing. the initial group that ran to Jerusalem, if indeed things play out that way. Needless to say, Satan then goes after the remnant, those that keep the testimony of Jesus Christ, and there is a religious persecution, and people are killed. And the Bible does say that there are others that have to be brought to death in terms of this religious persecution, like those before them. Mm-hmm. As that story plays out, eventually another power, the Asian powers that came together with the Islamic nations, they too pulled away from the beast. And now they pose a serious military threat. That group of people they recover from a military act of chemical warfare. Once they recover from that attack, they now have a counterattack, and they have a very large, formidable army, and they now move against the beast, who's stationed in Israel. The beast now leaves Israel with his army to go meet this army, and for an hour there is a nuclear war. 1/3 of humanity is killed in 1 hour. God said, were it not for the elect, then no flesh would be saved alive. And if this time were not shortened, nobody would live. It is at that moment that Christ returns. And when those two armies see Christ return, they stop. And now they join forces, and they have to return, travel back to Jerusalem to meet Christ. And that's what we see and celebrate and picture in the Feast of Trumpets. So this story, as you can see, is not something that anybody would tell children, but it's still a story that needs to be told. It's still a story that needs to be understood and repeated each year. And it's a story that we are acclimated to as we approach the Feast of Tabernacles.